forms, but also as an imaginative presentation of pagan and mythic past. In this way, there was a divided impulse formed out of pre-Christian life and post-Christian secular life. But this is we've visited this last year in the Wallace collection, Perseus and Andromeda. But this was going to the personal chambers of the King of Spain, Philip II. This is Rome, which is a city of lairs. It's an ancient city, it's a Baroque city, and it's a modern city. Rome is known as the eternal city and stands as a monument to its own imperial past, even the ruins that remain ever splendid to them. And through this, the city became part of the collective imaginary of the ancient world. The Nazi appropriation of Rome as a city outside of modern time, a city built on the master-slave dialectic, is an example of how time flows both ways. It creates and produces and reproduces itself in different guises. Piranesi, who was considered one of the greatest printmakers of the 18th century, his work mainly focused upon dreams of antiquity, and many of his prints of Rome were sold to tourists. But this in turn shaped the European view of reality of Rome. His etchings of the underworld mutated into visions of prisons and infernal factories, which anticipate a filmic depiction of dystopia. These are Piranesi's prints, which is say as a mutation between ancient ruin and a sort of utopian imagination. Intellectuals were both linked to lineages of thinking, which went back to ancient cultures, but also a resistance to these. In Germany, the German Romantics were fascinated by ruins, particularly of the classical world, and with this a textual fragment, which was a feature of pre-Socratic philosophy. German modernity formed some of its roots within the relationship formed by Romanticism to the ancient world. The image of Walter Benjamin. And in a way, as an intellectual, Benjamin never settled in any given, is not related, I mean, he's most closely related perhaps to Berlin and to Paris, but he wanders from city to city in order to open out the new continent of thinking and observation. In this way, he developed a space of traditions, memories, and insights through which a texture of difference might be understood. It is as though through travel he was able to create a sense of the yet to come beyond space. So he wrote, I mean, smoking hashish in Marseille, or wrote on Naples, or childhood in Berlin, or this great Parisian work, the Arcades Project, The Wandering Figure of Baudelaire. His focus on Baudelaire as a rag picker, a sort of someone who's both fascinated by the crowd and repelled by the crowd, repelled by the new city, and a dreamer of other spaces, other worlds. So Walter Benjamin created a portrait of Paris in the advent of modernity. He records the development of consumer capitalism, and with this a new pattern of behavior. This also results in shifts in technology such as a camera. Indeed, in a way, Benjamin saw the Arcades Project as a rewriting or a reconfiguration of Marx's Das Kapital. Das Kapital was to the industrial paradigm as the Arcades Project was to consumer capitalism, a new advent of capitalism, a much more deeper, far more subtle way of understanding the microcosm of gesture. So the coming of the camera, the click of the camera, or the lighting of a cigarette, or the way people handled the shopping looked in arcades, wandered and lingered through city spaces. It's also said that he saw Paris as a city of ghosts. So already the sense of Paris is inhabited by the ghosts of the commune. So Baudelaire is simultaneously at the very heart of the ongoing transformation, yet at the same time his condition of his estrangement, attachment and nerve ends, of emergent reification. Reification is also alienation or estrangement, lodged in the commodity world. Baudelaire loved solitude, but he wanted it in a crowd. Through the single figure, we become witness to the material shifts of the city, the arcades, shop window displays, railway networks, glass combined with iron, street lights, exhibition halls, space of advertisements, and side by side with these changes, also a new emotion, fear, revulsion, and horror-worthy emotions in the big city crowd arise for those who first observed it. So a shift in not just architecture and the configuration of the city, the broader avenues and the arcades, but also within the motions, and which ripple through crowds. So we don't just see the advent of photography, we see the advent of crowds and new forms of behavior, new emotions, new forms of behavior. This is Baudelaire, the poet, who wrote one of the formative texts on modernity. So you get the concept of everyday life. And with everyday life, you get the figure of people caught in isolation in the crowd or alienation. You get a certain look of estrangement, which Manet caught so wonderfully in his study of Olympia and Bar of the Folies Bergère. In fact, the fact that Benjamin wrote no more city portraits in the period of after 1933 can be likewise explained by the date in question. At the time the story was circulating in the emergent immigrant community about a Jew who planned to emigrate to Uruguay, and his friends seemed astonished that he wanted to go so far away. He retorted, "Far from where? The loss of one's homeland, the notion of distance disappears. If everything is foreign, then the tension between distance and nearness within the city portraits draw their lives that cannot exist." It's a wonderful study by city portraits by Peter Solmsey. So can someone read this? Someone read. Just do it.
Modernity brought with it a near explosive expansion of the population. Factory production and the advent of new sources of power served to rupture traditional modes of the assembly of goods, introducing the division of labor with commodity production as its outcome. With this, the human and the machine became a closer unity within the regulated apparatus of the factory.
Go on.
Nazi ideology both embraced modernity on the level of technological organization, but combined this with mysticism and images of the archaic past. The swastika, for instance, was an ancient religious symbol, which was in turn appropriated by the Nazi Party as its main emblem of representation. It aimed at the total organization of the social structure.
This is a model that Albert Speer built for Hitler of the future Berlin. And of course it was modeled on Rome. The idea of creating a 1,000-year Reich found its expression in the model of the New Berlin that Albert Speer created for Hitler. It was based on the fantasy of ancient Rome. So again, it's another sort of appropriation, both the appropriation of an idea of a 1,000-year. I mean, Rome was not 1,000 years, but this idea of the eternal city, he wants to recreate that feeling of an absolute, a city which doesn't mutate, doesn't suffer from fashion. The opposite of Baudelaire's Paris. And to this idea of the city brought the spectacular nighttime vision of a city, of parades, and when they had these parades, of planes flew over the low flying across the parades, and the spotlights picked out the aeroplanes in the sky. So it was a total spectacle of noise and light and space and crowds and unity of purpose and voice. The Nazi Party assembled and transformed the city into militarized zones based upon the idea of a location for a pure Aryan race. Society became divided into vast in and out groups in which Jews, Gypsy, homosexuals, and communists were sent to camps, either to work as slaves or to be eliminated within the process of industrial death. So there's a kind of real paradox at the heart of the project, this eternal city of the New Berlin, 1,000-year Reich, with this building of camps to eliminate, industrial elimination of people. So Giorgio Agamben says that modern totalitarianism can be defined as the establishment of the means of a state of exception, of a legal civil war that allows the physical elimination not only of political adversaries, but of entire categories of citizens for some reason cannot be integrated into the political system. This is a model of Hitler's bunker. So he dreamt of a 1,000-year Reich in a New Berlin, and he finished up in the basement of a bunker. And this was in contrast to his mountain retreat, which was his main dwelling at the start of the war, as projected dwelling after the imagined victory of the war. For Hitler, his imagination of the master race was close to the sky, but the final reality was the opposite destiny. Someone read this.
Go on.
Sorry. Paintings are invariably linked to the city and studio spaces of their conception, but also to the impulse to escape them. Lines are drawn to create the space of the painting, but lines are also drawn through networks of influences and traditions. Out of all these intersecting lines, emerge invisible lines that redraw the map out of which the new emerges.
This image of Venice in the 15th century. Venice formed itself as a powerful city-state by virtue of its location as a gateway to the east, and with this, its status as a global trading center. Renaissance art was in part defined by the relationship between these two different aesthetic orientations formed in Venice and Florence, a difference based on color and line. This is Bellini, portrait of Sultan Mehmed II and a young man. Bellini spent 15 months in Constantinople in order to paint the Sultan. So it's sense in which Venice, its location next to the Ottoman Empire, next to Constantinople, was both portrayed but also cultural influences. So a lot of the goods from the East, the silks and the porcelain, and the scents and different exotic goods came through Venice, and Venice became a great trading city, but also a mutation between the often textiles from the Italian Renaissance could be Ottoman and vice versa. This is Canaletto. And Canaletto was 18th century and was particularly collected by the English aristocracy. English country houses are full of Canalettos. It's almost like the equivalent of a billionaire's postcard. I've been to Venice, and here's the proof of it. So one of the great objects of desire of the Grand Tour, the purpose of painting signified a memory trace of this journey and was a demonstration of the exotic appeal of this experience. And Canaletto came, not only sold paintings of Venice, but he came to London and did painting and sold to the same clientele, paintings of the Thames in particular. So in the 18th century, we start to find travel between continents more common. So Delacroix visited Morocco in 1832 and discovered another world, not only one based on an Orientalist fantasy. In Morocco, he mixed with both Arab and Jews, and the subject matter of his painting reflected a feeling close to encounter with people and place. So there was both the projection of a vision which was already being formed in the common imaginary, particularly in France of North Africa, but also he added to that observation of his experiences in Morocco and understood the dynamics between racial differences of Jews and Arabs, whereas in a way, Gauguin, when he traveled to the South Seas, he took within images of what he thought he was going to find, Javanese images of Javanese sculpture, woodblock prints from Japan, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and so he had a kind of idea of a mutation of a paradise he was about to find, and in a sense he didn't ever really paint his misery. He was a lot of the time very depressed and miserable when he was in Tahiti and suffered from syphilis and died a miserable death. But he stuck to the image he had when he traveled there. He wanted to find something in opposition to the life in France, which he found was likewise miserable. He started life as a banker and hated bourgeois life. As Cézanne marks Mount Saint Victoire. Impressionists and post-impressionists painted directly from nature in order to capture play of light and form within the exact place. Cézanne evoked the notion of the struggle before nature in order to realize his vision. It's not only a struggle before nature, but it's also the painting this space in between the object of perception, the subject of perception and the object of attention. So Merleau-Ponty said he painted the flesh of the world. This is Boccioni, the Italian futurist. So city space was transformed by not just by speed, but by the new energy of electricity and construction and sort of unbelievable scale of things. And city spaces were transformed by these new dynamics. So Of course, in a way, groups like the Futurists and Cuba Futurists wanted to capture this movement, speed and force. It was painted in 1910, presented an enormous release of forces of industrial society with the sensation of shock. This is Marinetti, the poet and writer and leader of the futurist movement in Italy. We will sing of great crowds excited by work, by pleasure, and by riot. We will sing of the multicolored polyphonic tides of revolution in the modern capitals. We will sing of the vibrant, mighty favor of arsenals and shipyards blazing with violent electric moons, greedy railway stations that devour smoke-plumed serpents, factories hung on clouds by the crooked lines of their smoke, deep-chested locomotives whose wheels paw the tracks like the hooves of enormous steel horses. This is Kirchner. Already you get this feeling, not just of crowds, but of sort of something which is sort of almost in mood sickly. A sort of feeling of being trapped in a crowd. The mood is one of intensity and dissonance. This is the George Gross, who captured it's a kind of form of Cuban futurism, but it captures the sense of being in a city and being overwhelmed by the chaos and intensity and movement and sheer madness of vision which befell on city spaces. Populations expanded just so rapidly between the late 18th century and the late 19th century and early 20th century. George Gross captured Berlin as Berlin city space transformed by electricity. Everything was on the move as if propelled by forces of animation. In much of his smaller work, Gross captured his transformation of city life in bars, brothels, hotels, streets. And particularly captured nightlife, all the new bars and forms of behavior, all of the addictions and the reifications and stereotypical appearances. This is a photograph by the Russian futurist Rodchenko. Puts a parade, but he creates a dynamism out of the geometrical configuration of the marching crowds. So you get this with someone like Rodchenko, you get this formal configuration of crowds, but you get this mixture between Berlin, which was a great center, and what happens in revolutionary Russia. This reflection of a communist vision of social order. For us, I opened up Paris to his penetrating eye, especially to nighttime. His vision is atmospheric, made up of mists and shadows touching lonely figures in the dark. He had a fascination for the graffiti on the walls, out of which a publication was produced, Paris at Night. And he also was one of the first photographers to just pay attention to graffiti on the wall. He did a series of photographs which became a book on graffiti. Seen this before, Max Ernst. He went to Cambodia and witnessed the almost city remains of Angkor Wat, one of the biggest cities in the 10th, 11th century in the world, was eaten up by the forest when he went to visit it, and he saw that as being the future of cities of the wars to come. So as if he was anticipating when he painted this, the war, Europe after the rain. It was a vision of the Angkor Wat ruins, which inspired his portrayal of a post-human world, of both of ruin and metamorphosis. He was in turn inspired by the paintings of Gustave Moreau in the late 19th century, early 20th. He's a great Hungarian photographer. So with the advent of photography, we not only get street photography, we get the invention of the idea of the pictorial possibilities of photographing the street. Rodchenko does special angles, and followed by other modernist photography, which photographs in this case from above and gets the shadows and the abstractions of the movement. Same photographer, the same, in a way, similar poetics. And Giacometti created a vision of subjects moving through city space in a state of isolation from the other. City Space was made in 1948 and captured prevailing ideas related to being and the void. It's just after the Second World War. It becomes an emblem of, this work becomes an emblem of new culture of existentialism. So being and nothingness. This is Edward Hopper Gath from 1940. The American social landscape with this sense of isolation and estrangement, this word again, estrangement or reification as it appeared to articulate. So people alone with at night. This is Lowry, perhaps an unusual inclusion, but he stayed in the same areas of Salford and painted in Salford mainly, and captured the post-World War of ruined architecture and dismal social conditions, but nevertheless a sense of a community based on an area of Greater Manchester. They painted mainly from two different locations within a grimmer industrial landscape. He had a collection of clocks at home which were all set at different times because he said that he didn't want to know the real time. And that's a wonderful image. A room full of clocks, all at different times. Perhaps we all live like that now. There's groups like that. We're all in different time zones. One of the refugees from Germany, Frank Arbach, came to London as a refugee in 1939. Just before the war started. He was fascinated by the war-torn London landscape and produced a whole series of building site paintings which recorded the process of restoration. There's paintings of Mornington Crescent. He's like Lucian Freud also, who he befriended, was immigrated from, was a refugee. Moving forward, this is a painting by George Immendorf, and it's a series of paintings he did of an imaginary nightclub under the Berlin Wall, Café Deutschland, he calls them. And it's, in a way, it's a memory of Berlin in the 20s as much as Berlin of the more recent Berlin of the 1980s, the decadent Berlin. So two Berlins of the 20s and the 80s. And this nightclub underneath the wall, which mixes the memory of the 20s and the actuality of the 80s. Who did it between 77 and 84. So they float in time, and the location is inexact. This is ex-Royal College painter Caroline Walker, who paints female subjects, but typically of women working in hotel rooms alone or doing homework, nurses, or so captures again. It's like a meeting point between painterly, the sort of relationship to Manet and even to Edward Hopper. There's sort of contemporary feeling of women working alone or in small groups.
What is her name, Jonathan, again?
Caroline Walker. She was in the painting department about 10 years ago. And she's recently become a huge figure. She sold a couple of paintings at the last auctions in Sotheby's and Christie's for £500,000. Not that that's related to anything other than money, but the subject of my paintings in a broader sense is women's experience, whether it's imagined interior life of a glimpsed shop worker, closely observed portrayal of my mother working in a family home, or women I had the privilege of spending time with within the place of their work. From the anonymous to the highly personal, what links the subjects is an investigation of experience which is specifically female. Sections on street photography. Robert Frank produced a collection of photographs for his publication, The Americans. The project was set in the 50s and resulted in 10,000 miles of travel, and it captured a view of American life that was rarely exposed before. So the photographs are all sort of fractured, they're not composed, they're centered. Some of it's out of focus. It's obscure what the narrative, if there is a narrative, is. Captures the immediacy and the movement and the experience of the city. Again, Robert Frank from 55. Here you see the faces hidden in shadow or by the flag. Very startling photograph. William Klein produced a book, a photograph based on the city of New York, which served as a template for other books on cities, became a big influence, particularly on the Japanese photographer Daido Maruyama. It's a photograph from his downtown New York. Again, William Klein. This is Friedlander. Friedlander emerged in the 1960s as a street photographer. His aim was to capture American social landscape. His work loaded the frame with details that served to add density to what was being presented. Shadows, reflections, and mirrors, advertising images, street signs, all appear to compete for attention and in turn create a redistribution of visual spectacle. So it's sort of multiplicity of viewpoints, not a single viewpoint. And the advertising and sign language compete with people on the street and with dispersal of architectural focus through sign economy and through movement of crowds. This is, again, Friedlander. When I take photographs, my body inevitably enters a trance-like state, bristly weaving my way through avenues. Every cell in my body becomes as sensitive as radar, responsive to this life of streets. If I were to give a word, I would say, I have no choice. I have to shoot this. I can't leave the place for another's eyes. I have to shoot it. I have no choice. Said this in an endless murmuring refrain. So his relationship to the city is that he absorbs himself into city space. It becomes electric with impulses and desires and kind of energetics of the city space. He often takes photographs from his hip rather than for composing it through his eye, captures images through accident as much as through composition. And as such, the images are often out of focus or blurred or badly composed. This is Daido Maruyama, probably shot in the area of Shinjuku in Tokyo. But just like Benjamin talked about new moods and new forms of behavior, Daido Maruyama catches just this brief gesture, posture, kind of a rare moment of a flash of intensity. Rather than being cool and detached, he wants to capture the world close up and decentered. He said, if an image is shaking, it's okay. If it's out of focus, it's okay. Clarity is what photography is all about. So he introduced very much the blur and the crop, and at times his photographs become very abstract, almost light and movement, blemishes and blurs. So this Japanese female photographer, Tatsu Suzuki, Hirari Matsumoto. There's a sort of sense of capturing loneliness. So we again get this sort of extreme graphical portrayal of loneliness, which continues this theme which we get from Impressionism onwards, but it becomes more, we could say, architectural. The photographer Junichi Hakayama brings a new dimension to street photography. There's a sense of figures passing through non-places, which I forgot to add the sentence, or the sentence disappeared. It's the work of Melissa Breyer. Graffiti has been a persistent feature of city life, but it was with the advent of color spray paint that it became ubiquitous, mixing aesthetic immediacy with illegality. This is Jean-Michel Basquiat. this is Keith Haring on the Underground. Journeys into zones of exteriority, the regions that figure the remote and the exotic on the edge of this world. They are wild, asocial spaces rarely frequented by human exploration. This feeling of the elsewhere place is often complemented by an excessive surface elaboration, as if the process of perception has been intensified. The Peter Doig painting. So we get, in contrast to city spaces, the artists traveling from cities into other regions. Peter Doig's paintings are based upon a multiplicity of locations, North America, the Caribbean, Europe being the main places. In these locations are folded into memories of painters encountered, in particular North American sublime, German romanticism, and various manifestations of expressionism. The combination of all these travels, memories, and references give rise to surprise within his art. This is the painter Hervin Anderson, another painter who was at the Royal College. But his work, it depicts the places where memory and history converge. By a Royal College tutor, got her name. I work with her all the time. Hester Teichmann photographs were invariably set within remote locations, forests, caves, and swamps. In 205. This is Michael Armitage, who had a large show recently in London. The White Cube. He was born in Nairobi, but he started to employ oil on Lubega, which is a bark cloth found in Uganda. He provides the surface for a whole number of striations which create textural ruptures which relate place to perception. And finally, film culture. Film culture appears as a prevailing form that rewrites the city as the imaginary other that is darker, sexy, and more dangerous than reality, in the form of modern-day myth production constructed on excessive codes of exaggerated gestures. So the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920 is a silent horror film, and the first German expressionists, or the first of the German expressionist movement, with exaggerated shadows and distorted geometry, reflects anxiety of the German psyche after the post-war World War I period. Metropolis from 1927, Fritz Lang, became one of the most influential films in terms of generating dystopian images of the city. Metropolis. Metropolis. I mean, it's sort of influenced in turn by Piranesi. On the Waterfront by Elia Kazan, set in the docklands of New York. The film depicts the politics of union organization which had been infiltrated by the mob. The method of acting which is employed, it takes the audience inside the expressive texture of various characters which open out a grimy social scenario which is brutal in its import. It stars Marlon Brando. I could have been a contender, he said. He threw a boxing fight for the mob. He goes against the mob in the end. one of the great post-war city films set in Vienna, Third Man, 59, directed by Carol Reed, and set in post-war Vienna. It's as if the narrative itself is a journey into the seedy, dark underbelly of the city that casts grim shadows into the largely unlonely nighttime world in which nothing is quite as it appears. Central character is played by Orson Welles. Is played by Orson Welles and appears and disappears by virtue of the shadows the city casts. In contrast to the film noir of, an example, West Side Story is a musical with hard-edged depiction of gang warfare in New York. But it kind of created an image of New York for a period of the 60s, the Kennedy period. From 62, a contrasting film, Le Jetée, is set in Paris after World War III, and all the survivors are living underground. Experiments are conducted in time travel because the space has been rendered off limit due to radioactivity. So again, we get this image of the underground. So we've been to Hitler's bunker, to George Immendorf, now to Le Jetée, post-Second World War. We've been to the ruins of Piranesi. In the film, 2 or 3 things I know about her. From 67, Godard creates a portrait of Paris in conjunction with the life of a housewife who becomes a prostitute in order to afford extra things. Film shows the dynamics of the new emerging phase of consumer capitalism, and with this, the advent of the spectacle. References to the Vietnam War are the counterpoint to images of urban construction of lives exchanged for things. One of the great Godard films. It's got the famous coffee cup scene where they're in a cafe, a man and a woman in a cafe looking at a coffee cup. It's the main character. A little bit later, we get the film Midnight Cowboy, set in New York, about hustling and, again, seedy underworld of New York. And these new characters emerge who tell stories of the dark underbelly of the city, whose very fabric appears to reflect the decadence of Berlin in the 20s. We become witness to hustlers, corrupt police, pimps, gangsters, with its new codes of exploitation. This taxi driver. The Godfather by Francis Ford Coppola was a film made out of 3 episodes. It was a study of the evolution of life of a mafia family. It portrays the way in which the structure of the business was transformed by changes within structures which enable the mob to be absorbed into corporate structures. So in a way, we go from the street to a more corporate, reified world. We travel to Cuba and the gambling dens of Cuba, but largely transition from bootlegging whiskey in the period in which it was banned to heroin taking over the scene. Blade Runner by Ridley Scott from H2 was clearly influenced by Metropolis, but its vision of various cities mutated into a universal city of the future. So we get a sense in which it's Tokyo, it's New York, it's downtown LA. So then stories of revolution, counter-revolution, war as events of sustained interruption and discontinuity. After the ruination of its cause, history is rewritten and lives are turned over and never to again feel quite at home. War is uncanny, or even the most uncanny of all events, and therefore can be understood as a break time event. This is painted by Delacroix, Liberty leading the people from the early bourgeois revolution in Paris. The Commune represented one of the first major revolts of the population against central authority of state power. After its defeat, Paris was redesigned with broader avenues in order to facilitate the control over the eruption of revolts, employing barricades. Here, Berlin reduced to ruin at the end of World War II. It's one of the most bombed cities of the whole of the 20th century. This is a cultural revolution which Mao outmaneuvered his opponents by kickstarting the revolt of the younger masses of China. It's one of the great, not great exactly, it's called the Great Proletarian Revolution. But it was a great iconoclastic event which large parts of tradition were destroyed. The classroom was destroyed. The often places of religious worship or homes of rich peasants, or furniture was burned, objects were burned. Great wave of destruction of tradition, and authority was undermined. So it changed the direction of Chinese society. No structure remained untouched, no tradition went unchallenged in the tumult of mass action inspired by Mao. May 68 in Paris started as a student protest against prevailing conditions of life, but its demands quickly articulated a desire for the overthrow of the social order, and it triggered a revolt across the major cities of the world. So in a way, again, this is another way of seeing the memory of the commune erupting. This is an image of a city where you get no autonomous street life. You get this giant figure of Kim Il-sung looking over deserted, the most controlled city space that's ever been designed in the world. Everything revolves around the voice of the commands of the great leader who embodies the spirit of the father of the revolution, Kim Il-sung, who appeared to survey the whole public space through his monumental scale. New cities start to emerge, such as Dubai, and the new patterns of civil life appear, dictated by post-historical logic of obedience to prevailing spectacle. Newly constructed cities are predominantly designed about relationships to known places, airports, cultural centres, shopping malls, stadiums, hotels, high-rise apartment blocks, transport hubs. In each of these places, there's a sense of both passing through, but also surveillance. Unlike all the cities, all the signs of disorder are eliminated as part of the design. What is on display are signs of ever-present newness in cities without memory. Someone read this.
Globalism as a structure has brought to the fore the structure of city-states, concentrating immense economic, social, and aesthetic power. In many ways, they are an image as much as a material structure, exerting fascination. Even in decline, the memory of them is retained, so in a way, they fold back upon themselves. So the events of May 68 are never erased from the image or memory of Paris.
These are the books that might be. Won't read that. Invisible Cities by Talio Corvino. Arriving at each new city, the traveler finds again a past of his that he did not know he had. The foreignness of what you no longer are or no longer possess lies in wait for you in the foreign unpossessed places. The Invisible City is marvelous. It traces the travels of Marco Polo in the time of the Yuan dynasty. That's time when the Mongols controlled China, and the Kublai Khan got him to relate stories of cities he's traveled to. In a sense, every city is the same city that he tells his stories about, which is Venice, but he doesn't name Venice. So it's this sort of the relation between real cities and imaginary cities. It's a rapid journey through 2,500 years of history of city spaces. Sorry. But a lot of it was to do with memory and the way in which memory moves backwards and forwards.
There is a, sorry.
Go on, you talk.
There is a book written by John Berger called Here is Where We Meet. I really like that one because it mentions the idea of links memory of people and with the city. So each chapter the author like go to a different city and linked it with his parents, his sister, his lovers. And when you read these texts, it seems like you are talking with these people and also roam in the city. So it's your presentation just reminded me of this book.
Thank you for that reference. I knew that must have evoked something for you. You've lived in 2 major cities.
Yeah. And now also up to age of 6, I traveled a lot with my parents, mostly by car, and different sort of continents, different cities. And I remember just entering a new city as a child and how it felt and how different things were from country to country. It was just magical. I loved the fact that they were so distinct. Like Germany was Germany, and America was America, and England was so different. But recent travels, I don't travel as much, but recently when I go to places, like I went to South America because I always wanted to go there. And things seem to be merging into one, which is really sad. It's sort of places are slowly losing.
The same shops, the same architecture, same city planning.
Yes,
network.
I prefer it when you get culture shock. It's inevitable, I guess.
What's your most distinct memory of Tehran? The city?
Mine.
Yeah, yours.
We moved to Tehran. We lived by because my father was in the Navy. We lived by the sea. We lived in the south mostly, and in the north by Caspian Sea. So by Persian Gulf, and then we moved to Caspian Sea. I didn't like Tehran at all. It was just polluted, full of pretentious people, and it was really stressful. But I think, just generally speaking, I'm not a fan of capitals usually, apart from London. Having said that, London is also very stressful to live in. It's very competitive. There are not enough resources for the population, but it is a very interesting city. So.
And Sharon, you moved from Australia to Europe.
Yeah, and then also lived in Hong Kong and watched what happened in Hong Kong. So it's very interesting to think about erasure and think about loss of culture. And when you were talking, I was thinking too about with graffiti. There was this character, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, called the King of Kowloon, and he was adamant that he was originally the king, or his family. He had lineage, and his family owned the island basically, and so he would spend his days, and I've got a book there somewhere, I'll grab it before we finish, writing the most extraordinary calligraphy about his lineage. So he would write, sort of on lampposts, on phone boxes, on those sort of post boxes, those very colonial post boxes, all about where he came from, who he was, how he was related, and how he had some kind of ownership on the island, or of the island. But yeah, witnessing that sort of the degradation of culture and society, and it becoming more and more on a daily basis, these non-places and spaces, these shopping malls, these very highly surveyed spaces. Super, super interesting.
Fabiana.
I was thinking about two things about planet cities. This thing of homogenization of cities with and how that relate with architects signing the design of the city. So Henk Koolhaas with the Omar office, he's building loads of cities in Europe that they kind of have the same program. And then I think about Brasilia. In Brazil, it was planned, so the whole design of the city conducts how people should live and how the country could be reorganized, and is an idea that takes shape like in that scale. That is the opposite, or at least it creates the structure where a city will grow on top of it, but kind of predicts the behavior of people, or control. I think in the case of Brasilia, he borrows a lot from Washington, from the way you describe about Paris, with these large avenues. But I like with Brasilia, like one example that the city doesn't have corners, so there's always, if you go around, there's always a roundabout, and you don't have traffic lights, so everything is curved, so it's a constant flow, but everything converges to the center of the city, which is the bus station, that from there expands to the whole country, through roads. So everything is an idea taking shape, and all these things happens through competitions. And so I like how a project of a city gains wins a competition, and that becomes reality. And the other projects become utopian possibilities for the future. For that didn't happen. So
China.
Yeah, China a lot, isn't it?
Yes, it's 100% completely different. And actually, I was thinking about the relationship between the food and the country, because I just feel like every time I take airplane to go to another country or city, and when I find some food in the airplane, because the airport usually looks very similar. But if you try to order some food, the food is intensify all the difference. And I still remember last time our dinner is Indian food, right? And I feel like you can through one bite of the food, you can taste this country, taste the different culture and different how they grow up, how people think, and how they cook, and also how they feed the chicken. Even the same chicken, you taste very differently from different country. And I think the most important thing is about how people think, the way of they thinking in the different country, because we grow up from the different culture and different educational background. It's very interesting for me, I think.
Thank you for that. Who's else got a city, who's grown up in another city? Patrick's still there?
Yeah, I lived in Tokyo for 5 years.
Wow, that's a big story.
Yeah, that was, I took lots of places, really. I think Tokyo is a huge place. It seemed to me that there was so much going on underneath the surface, so many different things going on. It doesn't feel very homogenized at all. So many little stories everywhere you go. It's really alive, really, really alive. It seems so much going on there. You just feel like you could explore it forever.
What would you say are the characteristics of the underground city, the city of difference?
Well, I always had that feeling that everywhere there was another establishment. It's completely different to the next one, and the next one, and all the little caves hidden away under the ground, and they never closed. They were popping up everywhere, and just alive. Everything was alive everywhere. You look at a high-rise block in the UK, and it's like a homogenized bunch of things. In Japan, every single corridor has a completely different establishment, a completely different bunch of activities. It's like going into a crazy world of film where the world's changed. It's a bit like the way it's been depicted in science fiction. Yeah, I think it's a wonderful place to explore. Maybe it's difficult when you don't speak to me. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
I went to Beijing.
I enjoyed wandering around for 5 years.
When I went to Beijing, I've been to Beijing twice, and I got the feeling of hidden cities inside Beijing, of restaurants at the top of tower blocks where you don't see the entrance. So it's sort of.
I also have that feeling when I went to Taiwan a few times.
Yeah.
A lot of underground stuff.
and different flows of different populations. So people in the party, or people who are intelligentsia, or people who are conservative, or whatever, all have different ways of inhabiting the city. So it's a monstrously sized city with great motorways traversing it, and incredible speeds, and incredible architecture, and no unified vision. But it's all to do with an occupation of different social milieus, and with each.
What's going on in those cities is they're changing. It's the ones that are changing a lot that are the ones interesting, where it's really not defined what they are. There's just a lot going on because so at times I've been to Singapore a long time ago, and it was really interesting because it seemed there was a lot going on. But more recently, it didn't seem so interesting. It already happened. I mean, there's places in India that feel like that. They're just too crowded. Yeah, South America, I think, is amazing. You really have to get. You have to get out of the. You have to get in. You kind of have to take a few risks to get to where it's interesting. I never found the US very interesting. Never really get under the skin of the US city. And I went back to Bologna many, many times because of that place. I always thought it was some way really active. There was stuff going on there. I always met interesting people in Bologna.
Years ago, I knew these two Brazilian filmmakers. They're both called Celso, Celso 1 and Celso 2. They call them young Celso and old Celso. They're part of they've been tortured in Brazil. They've been imprisoned and tortured and left Brazil after the military took over. But they went to Mozambique and made a film about the resistance to Portuguese colonization of African Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau. And they were in London for a while, but they left to live in Paris. So I decided to go and see them. And I went to the address they gave, and they were not there. And by chance, I bumped into someone who said, "Oh, they've moved to so-and-so across Paris. Try this address." I found them in this tower block. And in this tower block, there was a French couple living. And that evening, they had someone got out this French guy got out this brown parcel, and it's filled with African grass. And I thought, what's this? And they were part of this African organization which smuggled grass from Zaire into Paris to fund this underground organization. And anyway, in the morning, I got up and I wanted to make a tea, and I went to the drawer in the kitchen, and there were guns. I thought, it's so weird. In an ordinary tower block, you've got a sort of organization of militants who are fighting, raising money for wars in Africa, but also immigrants in Paris fighting with our underground organization. I just thought, just by accident, I finished up in a sort of terrorist cell. And I thought that was so strange about cities, the hidden life of cities. That was in the 1970s. You could go to Berlin and you find similar flats. So these networks of strange political organizations which traverse new populations, and that's a story.
It's true though, and they sort of feel like labyrinths. I remember coming to London and thinking, I don't understand this. I don't know the city, and it's like it's almost like playing some computer game where you're kind of working on one level, and it's not until you get to a point where you've got a key to access a door that you can kind of get through to that next level. And it's someone that you met 3 steps ago and you didn't know to ask them for the key, so you got to go back, trace back to get to that point where you can then go further forward. I had a real sense of that. I still do with London, that it's a series of unlocking.
I think it's also quite interesting, Sharon, that you mentioned that, because I found London so easy to navigate. You go to subway, you go northbound, eastbound, and you know where we are. I found that when I was traveling in Washington many years ago, a couple of days staying with friends, all those subway, I think it was color-coded somehow. This line gets to whatever Smithsonian Museum and whatever. That seemed to be all so logical. And perhaps I'm a very much a left brain kind of person. So it could be individual and how the environment and individual sort of interact each other. Just wanted to add that.
The other journey I remember was in 1979 going to New York for the first time. And it was just New York was at that point out of control. It was, you went to central Manhattan and you walked the streets and always people coming out, do you want to score? Do you want to hit? Do you want to, can I mug you? Not quite like, can I? It was dangerous. Do you want a blow job? Do you want anything? But it was as if the whole city was also rotting and couldn't. I mean, it's sort of changed beyond downtown. New York was dangerous, and now it's chic and all designer shops and smart restaurants and
but funnily, I was talking to someone yesterday and they said that they've got a colleague in New York that was mugged at sort of 8 o'clock in the morning going across the road to go and grab a coffee first thing in the morning from the office in Midtown. And she said it's actually going back the other way to what it used to be. It's actually becoming a much more dangerous city to live in now. People aren't going out after certain times, and we're not talking like sort of Harlem. We're talking like really just the wrong side of the street on the wrong side of mid.
I don't want to go to New York again. I've not been for years, but it was pretty wild.
But I mean, I don't know.
It was very. There was downtown scene and uptown scene. So uptown scene was blue chip, and downtown was emergent, and it mixed with music scene with writers and musicians and artists all mixed together. All went to the same clubs and bars and like the Vitality. There were a lot of spaces which were not commercialized spaces.
Yeah, I agree. I went to some amazing openings down on sort of the lower, sort of down around 2nd Street or something. I mean, extraordinary things going on that you've no idea. You're just walking into what looked like someone's apartment.
Mm.
But my question too for other people who traveled and lived in other cities was, did they feel different? Because I remember the first time I ever came from Australia to Europe, and it was such a long journey. So it was 24 hours in a plane, and thinking I would be different when I got there. And I remember this incredible sensation of I hadn't changed. And maybe over time the city changes you, but to arrive into a place where it was like, oh, there's this endless possibility to change and adapt, but actually just thinking, oh, I'm still me and I'm just in a different location.
I think for me, like when I take the plane to go to London, I feel it's totally different culture and situation, and I my old friend, my old family, they have been left in China, and I can have a totally new beginning. So I can try many different things that I did not dare to try before. Yeah, I think it's quite ambitious and vibrant. Like, okay, so many things I want to have a try, and so many words I want to say. Yeah, I do have this kind of feeling, but after I stayed here for like over 1 year or 2 years, it's kind of very strange bond with your hometown. You will realize it's still bound in your blood, it's still bound in your deep heart, and it will recover and it will reveal again sooner.
That's so interesting, because it's so true that when you go somewhere new and nobody knows you, you can just create yourself new. You can be somebody completely different.
But the question is, do you?
I did.
My God, what were you before?
I do it all the time. I go to a hospital. I'm a different person. I had a friend who came and saw me there with her partner, because they just like they've broken a leg or something. This was many years ago, and they were both afterwards. They were like, "My God, we didn't recognize you. You're a completely different person."
I'd like to add, if I may, again about the person and the city and the interaction and how they relate to each other. Personally, I live in Hong Kong for 15 years, from Seoul, big city. So I think it's the energy level of city that's actually related to myself. And about 15 years ago, we moved to New Zealand, my husband in New Zealand, and I just living in Wellington, I got bored and bored and bored. So when I finally got a chance to London, it's like being alive again. The energy level of city like Hong Kong or London, which has so much on offer, I really enjoyed and in a way thrive when I was in London. And now I'm back in Wellington. I find myself planning for another trip, ASAP sort of thing.
The other city I visited was Berlin in the 70s. And it was still when the Berlin Wall was up. And most of Berlin, they sent all the out groups to Berlin. They said, the police would say to you, if you go to Berlin, we won't bother you. But if you stay in Hanover or wherever, we'll give you grief. So a lot of the transgressors and politicos all went to live in Berlin. And it was an enormous squat near the wall. It was a vast network of squats, one of the biggest squats in the world. And it was like different houses had different codes, so they have different flags, gay flags, communists, Trotskyists, anarchists, hipsters, you name it, anyone in that underworld variety had houses. And I remember visiting East Berlin, and we went to the Brecht's theatre. But we went to an apartment, and it was still the Berlin of the 30s. They hadn't done any building work on it, hadn't done any decoration. So it was still the Berlin of the 20s and 30s, and the building was rotting. And they hadn't done much building work. But these apartments were magnificent, huge ceilings and molded ceilings and very imperial. And they were living, like a school teacher who was on minimal wage would be living there. Very strange difference between the East and West.
Yeah, I went to Prague around the same time. You just had that feeling that the whole place was wonderful, but just crumbling. all the streets were covered with boards that would stop when the sculptures fell off the wall, they wouldn't land on the people. Scaffolding up all over the place. They didn't restore anything. It was just decaying and falling off the wall. It was a bit dangerous, so they cover all the street.
Where was that?
Prague.
Prague, yeah.
And it was a wonderful place, but so repressive. The shop, all the big, famous shop, all you could see in them were, in the windows, were tins of baked beans. It was the only thing that you seemed to be able to get was beer. And it was so different having a communist childhood or being a member of the party and not being a member of the party. And I just remember the pollution was, it rained, your skin but started to burn. I had a jumper that I really loved. It got holes all in it. Rain, these burnt marks. And it was just so polluted. If the wind blew the wrong way, they had to evacuate the border in Germany. So polluted. Such a strange place. They just was not touched at all after all. A wonderful place to go and see at that time. Really repressed.
I don't know if Wenyi and is it Yonyi? I don't know how to say. I don't know if you had the same sensation, but when I was living in Hong Kong and I kept coming back to Europe to visit in the summertime, I would have this total sensation that I was returning to Europe as a crumbling kind of museum piece. Each time I felt like there was such incredible technological advancement in the cities and the way in which the cities were developed and built. And just the way everything was moving forward. And then to return each time back to London or back to Greece or back to Italy, whatever, just felt like a sort of, a crumbling museum piece that was sort of, tourists were sort of piling into, but it had relevance more to the past, the antiquities, than it did to anything going forward.
When you travel to Naples from London, you get the feeling of an even more decaying, rotting city. And it takes you some time to discover the old Naples. It seems to be sort of buried within the modern...
While you're getting ripped off by the cab driver and everybody else.
Again, I think the individual experience are quite individual and different, isn't it? When I travel to a place like Rome or Florence or even Naples, yes, those remains of previous civilization history, and I remember thinking, right, okay, these people in Italy are really living off their ancestors from their histories and all that. But at the same time, again, perhaps because I'm personally interested in history and all those culture and classics, I usually enjoy those places visiting. But then going back to your question, Sharon, when I was traveling back to Hong Kong at the time, it's like, back to all that energy. And you might remember, if you're in Hong Kong, 90s and early 20s, even after the 97 handover, there you could almost smell the money in the air in Hong Kong. Everywhere, people are just walking, making money here and properties and all that. Anyway, I want to add one more thing on Patrick, though. About 3 years ago, I traveled to Prague with my husband, and we met up with a friend, American friends who moved back to the States after a 5-year stint in Wellington with a government job. And both were traveled and interesting people. We had a wonderful time in Prague with all those old city charm, plus our friend find Paul's, the sandwich croissant place. So we used to meet up in Paul's for a morning coffee. They were in Airbnb and were in hotel sort of thing. So yes, all the city charm and history plus modern city convenience. Maybe I was looking at the things too positive angle.
I think the thing about
again,
Prague,
individual experience are very different.
when did you go to Prague? Was it the reason my
about 3 years ago, before 2019, before I came to London, I was traveling in Europe with my husband at the time.
The reason for the strange experience in Prague was it was before the wall came down, and it was quite repressed there. It completely changed after the wall, and they repaired everything, but it was kind of in deep freeze for a very long time after the Berlin Wall went up. So it was because the wall was still up that it was a weird experience. I don't think many people were traveling to Prague.
I went to Prague about I don't know, 12 years or 15 years ago, I can't remember. And I had a very strange experience, a bit different to yours. I think it was just bad luck. That I was there for about 4 days. And I mean, from moment to moment, I had to just watch because somebody was trying to steal something. And it was just left, back and center. It was unbelievable. Even sitting in a cab, and I would catch them, and they were very argumentative, and it just ruined my holiday. And I was just really upset. Came away saying, who built this beautiful city? I don't see them here. It's different how the demographic can also change. And culture can also change. I mean, I've seen it in Iran anyway.
I mean, one thing I would say for myself, I think I changed a lot when I went to cities, but I think it depends on how you present yourself in the city and where you're going there. And also you get older and your reaction to the city. I think I changed dramatically when I moved to London. But I was just thinking about, this would be, when I was 18, I think, maybe, when I was 20, I went to Palermo. I didn't have any money, I went by train, and I was very scruffily dressed. And I met some Italians. Palermo was a crazy city. I didn't realize quite how crazy it was at the time. And I arranged to meet them at the train station, just before I was going back. And I arrived a little bit early, in my leather jacket and a bit looking scruffy, and I was surrounded by policemen who marched me off to the police station with these Alsatians. And I was locked in this. They put me in this police cell, and they closed all the windows, and they started screaming at me. And I sat there for about 30 minutes. I had no idea what they were talking about, but they was clearly thought it had something to do with drugs. And after about 30 minutes of being threatened, intimidated, they let me go. And I met the Italians and explained what had just happened. And they said, nothing, it happens all the time. No big deal. And I walked out the station, and a car knocked me over immediately. It's like such a crazy place. The minute I walked into the road, immediately he ran into me. It was like, on purpose, I'm going to get such a weird, crazy place. But I think I've been back, and it's completely different. But I think my persona was completely different when I went back the second time. I was married, I went that way. It's completely different.
You became a straight.
I mean, it is a lovely place. I think maybe the city became richer and sorted out its drugs problem.
Anyway, we've had a long conversation, almost an hour. Anyone, any final thoughts? Any very rich conversation? A whole collage of. I mean, we could have almost started from conversations about cities rather than PowerPoint. But who's to know? So next week, music. We'll see what happens. No one knows exactly what the other's going to do. So there's going to be some surprises.
What's the homework?
The homework is to select a song. I sent a list of songs which I selected, 50 songs, I think, and to choose one or choose one of your own making. And send me, if it's on YouTube, send me a copy of the YouTube connection. And we'll DJ and talk about experiences of music. So it could be music that you have listened to and it was a big event in your life. It could be to do with memory. It could be music that you play when you paint or make art. Could be to do with politics. It could be any conjunction that you decide. And it could focus on the relationship between a signifier, which is tone and spacing. And often you don't know the word. Often you might listen to a song and think it's happy, and actually the actual words are quite striated or difficult. Often the performance of music kind of makes you think contrary to what the music's saying. So do you listen with the a signifier, the tone and the melody, or do you listen to rhythm? Do you listen to spacing, or do you listen to words, or combination? So it's how you listen and how you make memories out of how you listen. Everyone get it? I don't know what the exercise is until it's done. So the exercise can completely transgress what I've sent as a starting point. But it'd be interesting, it gets us closer to each other in a way. Because it's about taste and predilections and moments. It recounts histories.
Just one or many?
One. I think one, if there's 10 of us turn out, 12 turn out, that's almost an hour of listening.
Shall we send the link to you before Monday?
Send me the link by Monday, and I'll share the screen from there. And you can have a standby just in case we run out of time. Have a standby for a second round. So maybe choose to.
You want us to write some text, yeah?
I want you to write a text or deliver a text. It doesn't have to be long, but something which is has a kind of life to it. Not a dry exercise, it's quite a moist exercise. Really enjoy today. Something slightly different again.
Me too.
I'll see you.
Thank you, Jonathan. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next week.
Bye.
See you.
Bye.